Humanities Center at the University of Oregon. Welcome to the final public lecture in the OHC's series on this year's theme, Convergence, Intersections Between the Sciences and the Humanities. At a moment when the humanities and the sciences are subject to growing skepticism and critique, when the humanities are being pressured to demonstrate their value in quantitative terms, when questions of ethics and justice regarding technological change and scientific innovation are increasingly pressing, and when the U of O is nearing completion on a new applied science campus aimed in part to access industry funding, we originally organized the Convergence Lecture Series to highlight key areas of human experience where science and the humanities intersect, as well as areas of divergence where science and the humanities could be brought into more productive relation. With the advent of the coronavirus epidemic, our theme has only become more relevant. Our speaker today is theoretical physicist and best-selling author Leonard Mlodinow, who will deliver the Oregon Humanities Center's 2019-2020 Kritikos Lecture. Established in 1993 through a generous gift from two of the OHC's loyal Portland patrons, the Kritikos Professorship brings to the university and to the state of Oregon distinguished scholars, critics, and leaders in the humanities. From the Greek, kritikos translates roughly as able to judge, evaluate, and criticize. As the term suggests, the Kritikos Professorship was created to foster the education of U of O students and faculty and to promote intelligent, critical public discourse across our state. Kritikos lecturers are known for speaking their minds, even if what they have to say is currently unfashionable. Both our theme of convergence as well as the Kritikos Professorship's charge to bring to the U of O and Oregon distinguished scholars, critics, and leaders in the humanities who actively promote intelligent and critical public discourse help explain why we selected Leonard Mlodinow as this year's Kritikos Professor. Leonard Mlodinow is a theoretical physicist and best-selling author recognized for groundbreaking discoveries in physics and a passion for making science accessible and interesting to the general public. He has held positions at Caltech and the Max Planck Institute for Physics and Astrophysics in Munich. In addition to academia, he has written for television and film and produced and designed several award-winning computer games created in conjunction with Steven Spielberg, Robin Williams, and the Walt Disney Company. Since 2013, Dr. Mlodinow has devoted his time to science writing. His most recent book, Elastic: Flexible Thinking in a Constantly Changing World, was published in 2018. In addition to Elastic, he has authored and co-authored many New York Times bestsellers: Subliminal: How Your Unconscious Mind Rules Your Behavior, War of the Worldviews with Deepak Chopra, The Grand Design with Stephen Hawking, The Drunkard's Walk: How Randomness Rules Our Lives, and A Briefer History of Time, also with Stephen Hawking. If you have questions at the end of the talk for Leonard Mlodinow, please type your questions into the chat feature of Zoom. You can access this feature by hovering over the bottom of the Zoom window with your cursor. The questions will be moderated by me and my co-hosts, and I will share them with Dr. Mlodinow. This talk is being recorded and will be available for viewing tomorrow on the Oregon Humanities Center's website and YouTube channel. At this moment of quarantine and COVID-19, Dr. Mlodinow will be sharing his insights on elastic, flexible thinking for our time of change. Welcome, Leonard, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Paul, and greetings everyone from the International Space Station, or at least so it seems. And I'd like to thank the Oregon Humanities Center and Paul Peppis, Melissa Gustafson, Gina Turner, Pat Gerhardt, and David Stern, everyone for inviting me. I wish I were actually there, but we'll see how this works from here. Let me share my screen and we'll get going with the talk. Let's see, there we go. Hopefully you can all see. I can't see it all, but that's okay. I know what's on it. So I'm Leonard Mlodinow. I'm going to talk about elastic thinking, flexible thinking for a time of change, which we're certainly living in now. If you want to follow me, my Twitter and Instagram is down there, and also my website. It's just my handles are just L Mlodinow. And so there we go. So sorry, a little glitch going, but I'm flexible. Hey, here we are, the agenda. We're going to talk about 4 topics today. First, the challenge of change. What is driving the change in society, and what is it like? How fast is it changing? Why do we need a new kind of thinking? Then we're going to talk about what is elastic thinking. I'm going to describe this kind of thinking that we do need for these changing times. And third, how does the brain create elastic thinking? And more importantly, what gets in the way? And then finally, some things you can do to nurture your own elastic thinking. So let's start with the challenge of change. This picture here shows a couple of guys who were clerks in a grocery store of about 100 years ago, actually, maybe 115 years ago, around 1905. Back then, a grocery store operated kind of the way a pharmacy does today. There were people who manned the counter, and behind them on shelves were all the goods. And so the customers would come in, tell them what they wanted, they would grab them, bring them out, collect the money, and so forth. And it was a very inefficient way of doing things. There were times of the day where there were huge lines because the few people behind the counter couldn't handle things that quickly. And there were other times of the day where these people were just sitting around playing poker because they had nothing to do. And the people who ran these grocery stores weren't making much money, and they were looking for a way to be more efficient. So the grocers in one area heard of a new grocery store in another state, and they asked a fellow named Clarence Sanders to go hop on a train and go over there and check it out, and steal their ideas and see if they could find a better way of doing things. And he did that, but he didn't find anything new there. However, it was still a lucky thing for the history of grocery stores, because he had been thinking about these problems all along on his way out there, on his way back. And as he was taking his train ride back, he spotted some pigs eating in a trough in a pig farm they were passing. And he suddenly had this flash of genius. This is something that's characteristic of elastic thinking, of how new ideas can come to us. They pop into our minds from our unconscious, and we're going to talk about that later. But his flash of genius was this: if pigs can serve themselves, why not people? And with this, he hatched the idea of the kind of grocery store that we have today, where you walk in and everything is arranged in aisles, and you flow up and down the aisles, collect what you want. Everything there has labels on it with the price. He had to invent a shopping cart so you had something to put it in, and so forth. He invented the entire architecture of the supermarket and what you needed to run one. And this was much more efficient. It was a brilliant idea. It wasn't necessarily accepted as one at first, because like many new ideas, probably like most new ideas, there was resistance to it. People had a certain way of thinking, and they had a hard time accepting the new assumptions and the new framework that was behind the new grocery store. But the grocery store did catch on, because it quickly became wildly profitable, and he became a multi-millionaire. These stores are actually still around. If you're especially from the South, they're called Piggly Wiggly. And so what happened in the grocery business due to Clarence Sanders was what we call in science and philosophy a paradigm shift. It's a situation where a certain way of thinking, a certain framework of ideas that was there, that everything was working inside of, suddenly gets changed and revamped, and a new way of looking at the whole world, or the whole world of this topic. And we have paradigm shifts in business. We have paradigm shifts in science, and they're behind a lot of very sudden changes in society. The virus and the pandemic that we have today is causing paradigm shifts in many areas that maybe we can talk about after the talk. This is a grocery store of several decades after Clarence Sanders, and it didn't really change much between his original idea and that. In fact, for many, many decades throughout the 20th century, there wasn't too much change in the world. The world really started changing a great deal in the early 2000s, and it really accelerated, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But until this 1950s, 1960s, things pretty much around the way he had invented. And since then, of course, we have computerized scanning, we have new ways of paying with credit cards or just your phone, and we have self-service, and things are changing more now, but they didn't for many decades. The reason that change in society has been taking off and becoming faster and faster is that's something that sociologists noted long ago, which is that many aspects of society exhibit what's called exponential growth. Let me start by clarifying something about exponential growth. Exponential people tend to use that as a synonym for fast in today's language, but it doesn't really mean that. If you look at this chart, this graph shows you a curve that displays exponential growth. Now you notice that at the left-hand side, where it's very flat, it's not growing very fast at all. It doesn't take off till much further on. What really defines exponential growth is that the quantity that you're tracking doubles in a fixed period. So if you look at the number 1, where there's very little, and you go to year 2, there's twice as much, but it's still very little, because little times 2 is pretty much still little. And it gradually builds over 3, 4, 5. And by the time you get toward the 8 or 9, then when it doubles, that's a huge jump. And that's what's happening in society. Society has always been changing, and people have always been complaining about it. But if you look at it objectively and look at the different measures that sociologists make, it's been growing exponentially, but that growth has been very slow compared to what it is today. Here's an example of some historical exponential growth. The chart graph on the left shows the exponential growth in the number of titles of fiction published in the first 200 years of fiction. It was doubling about every 35 years. On the right side, you'll see the number of scientific publications per year. It's doubling about every 9 years. And when I first started out in physics in the 1970s, as you can see, it was fairly low on the curve at that point. And it was still a time where physicists could understand a lot of things, the major trends in all areas of physics. If you look farther toward the right now, there's so much new research being done that we're really pretty much overwhelmed. You can follow some of the big ideas, but mainly you focus on your area or even your sub area. It's hard enough to keep up there. So what's been happening in society is that because our knowledge is growing exponentially and getting so great, the technology that feeds on that knowledge has also been jumping up very quickly. And the applications and the social change that they cause has also been increasing. And that's really the root of why we're in such a era of rapid change today. Here's an example of some of the kinds of change that are more characteristic of today. The doubling times are 18 months, 30 months. They're much faster than they traditionally have been. Some of the changes that we've seen, just when you think about it, just remember that the iPhone didn't come out till I think 2007 or 8. It didn't take off for a couple years. So all these changes are more or less in the last 10 or 12 years. The way we order food, the way we go to hotels, this kind of security that we need. We're being invaded now by people trying to take advantage of us on our computer, take over our computer, steal our information. All these different ways. The way when I was a kid, I talked to my parents on the phone. When I went to college, I had to stand by, wait for the coin-operated phone. I can't remember what it's called anymore, payphones. And we'd go in there and wait in line and make the call. You talk to your parents once a month. You might talk for 5 or 10 minutes, get off, and the next person would get on. Now I'm texting my kids daily. And it's not necessarily a huge thing I'm telling them like it was on the phone. It'll be a sentence, a few words, a picture. The way we communicate with everyone has just been revolutionized, and it's pretty much in the last 10 years or so. And of course, now with the coronavirus, we're seeing on top of all this exponential change, a huge jump, a huge black swan jump, an unexpected, unpredictable event that comes in and just reshuffles everything, which makes even more demands on our abilities at elastic thinking. Who today is living the way you did 5 months ago or 4 months ago? Our lives have been turned upside down, and your flexibility in thinking and in behaving is a big predictor of how successful you'll be and how you'll be able to thrive under these tough conditions. The big enemy of flexible thinking is what we call frozen thinking. This is a term that was invented by the philosopher Hannah Arendt. Frozen thinking has to do with the kind of thinking that people have when they have a hard time understanding the assumptions they've made and that those assumptions can be changed. They're a hard time accepting a new framework when one is demanded. So they continue to think in the old framework and they're not successful. The reason I have all the names of these failure businesses up here is just to illustrate what happens when people's thinking is frozen. It happens in your personal life. It also happens in the business world. Take Blockbuster, for example. I remember very well going to these Blockbuster stores and renting the VHS cassettes from them. Then this new technology called DVDs came, into being, and they were very slow to adopt it, which made a little bit of sense because they had all the VHSs. Why get the DVDs are smaller, lighter, more durable, but really they only have so much space in the store. But what happened was this little company called Netflix came into being, and they said, who needs the stores? We're going to send these discs back and forth. You don't have it, we'll cut out the stores. Blockbuster could be Netflix today had they only recognized that that was a good idea. But they were so mired in the old way of thinking that they saw it way too late, and they allowed Netflix to take a hold of that. A few years later, what happened was Netflix got criticized because they were looking at the new technology called streaming. Well, in streaming, the change from DVDs to streaming was at least as great as the change from the VHS to the DVDs. But Netflix didn't behave like Blockbuster did. They got into it early. They were criticized for getting into it too early. People said this streaming is kind of clunky. It's not fast enough. But they said it will be faster. We're getting into it now. So there's no Netflix 2. There is still Netflix because the company Netflix was able to adapt. And now they're making their own shows and streaming it. And who really mails in DVDs anymore? It really doesn't happen. So the remedy for dealing with change is what I call elastic thinking. Let's talk about what that is. Human thinking can be put on a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum is logical analytical thinking. That's the kind of thinking where the framework is already set for you. The rules of the game, your goals are set, the concepts by which you're going to think are already fixed, and they've been decided by you or somebody else previously. It's the kind of thinking that a computer executes when a programmer programs it. This is a traditional programmer. I'm not talking about the neural net systems today. But in traditional programming, I used to program, I would sit there, I would write out an algorithm for the computer to follow. Data would then come in, and the computer would grind through whatever my recipes were to come up with an answer. And that's great kind of thinking. It's traditionally what's been valued in society. We test for it on the SAT test for college entrance. Employers, when they interview people, they're trying to figure out if they're good analytical thinkers. It's really very important, but it only really works in a time where things aren't changing rapidly, because to execute your analytical thinking, you need to have that framework. At the other end of the spectrum is elastic thinking. So elastic thinking is the kind of thinking that builds that framework. It's not the rule-based A to B to C thinking, it's the rule-breaking thinking, where you're thinking, what should the new rules be? What should the assumptions be? One point I'll talk about later is that all our thinking and everything we do is based on certain assumptions, and we often don't even realize what those assumptions are. They're part of us, they're implicit, they're in our unconscious, there's something we grew up with, lived with, learned about, and we're operating within those assumptions without even realizing that we are. And elastic thinking is the kind of thinking that allows you to question, maybe change those assumptions, and to build a framework. When we reach a new situation or a situation changes, you need the elastic thinking to reach the new paradigm that's appropriate for that situation. Certainly, we're all being challenged to do that today with the pandemic, to live a new way, to question our assumptions in the framework of the way we were living. So we're all getting a lot of practice and exercise at this. This slide shows a word game that psychologists use sometimes when they study elastic thinking versus analytical thinking. The way the game is played is there's three words here. For instance, on the screen, it's crab, pine, and sauce. And your challenge is to come up with a fourth word that, when appended to the front or back of each of these words, gives you a new word in all three cases. And there's two ways that people go about this in laboratory studies. When scientists study them, they notice there's two ways that they do it. One is the analytical way, very methodical. You take one of the words, say the middle one, pine, and you go, okay, cone. That's a word, pine cone. Okay, does that work with sauce? No. Okay, next word. You think of another word that goes with pine, and you so on, and you try to explore very systematically. Other people don't do it that way. They think about the issue. They may start that way, and they think for a second. They get the challenge incorporated into their brain, and then they just kind of sit and relax, and they wait for the idea to pop into their mind. They just sit there, try to open their mind, and let the idea percolate up, just like Clarence Saunders' idea did when he saw the pigs at the feeding at the trough. Well, psychologists find that most people who get this who answer this correctly within the time given actually do it the second way. And what's really interesting is they can tell long before the subjects come up with the answer, which approach they're going to report that they took when they were asked later. And that's because the analytical thinking and elastic thinking use different neural pathways in your brain. And the scientists administer this while people are having their brains imaged, and they can tell which path they're going to take. The answer, if you're curious, by the way, in this case is apple, crab apple, pineapple, and applesauce. So let's talk about 5 important aspects of elastic thinking. The first one is the mindset. This picture, these 2 pictures are really a visual metaphor for what I mean in the contrast between analytic and elastic thinking. The top one is kind of classroom I grew up in. Everyone pretty much dressed alike. You sat in well delineated rows. You had an assigned seat. The teacher stood at the front of the classroom and dictated to you. The teacher told you the way things are, and you're supposed to learn it, and you're supposed to follow it. The teacher is like the executive. The teacher is the CEO. The teacher is telling you, the workers, what to do and how to go and about creating your product, which is in this case learning. In the lower one, this is elastic schooling. In that, the kids are much freer. They sit, they lay, they situate themselves how they like. They choose to a greater extent exactly what materials or tools they use to learn what they're supposed to learn. And it's a much less organized, less structured way of approaching education. And so that contrast really is a contrast that holds not just for school, but for business and science and all sorts of thinking. This guy with the blue glasses is Albert Einstein. He was about 25 years old at that time, and he was thinking about an important problem of his day. It had to do with an issue with the speed of light. In the 1860s, a guy named James Clerk Maxwell came up with a revolutionary theory of light and electromagnetism. And it's really the basis of what we know about those subjects today. It's the basis of radio and television and all sorts of things. But there was a little issue at the time that the speed of light didn't seem to work out really well with Newton's laws. It doesn't really matter what the specifics was, but this was a quandary, and many of the top physicists of the day were working on it. Einstein was not a top physicist of the day. He had gotten his PhD, didn't get a job, and was working in the patent office. He wasn't really wedded to the old way of thinking. But I'm showing you these equations here, not to scare you, but quite the opposite. I'm hoping they're familiar to you from your high school math courses. Because what Einstein came up with to solve this quandary was something any high school kid could have done and could do today. These equations here are pure algebra, and anyone who knows algebra could have solved the equation that led to what's now called special relativity. While all these professors who were very well known and well situated in their universities were beating their heads against the wall, trying to figure out within the existing framework of physics, within the assumptions and the framework that they grew up with, that they knew, they were trying to solve this problem with the speed of light. Einstein wasn't married to that at all. He was very open. He had an elastic mindset, and he asked himself, not given the framework of physics, how can I explain this, but just how can I explain this? And once he got the explanation, he went back and said, what does that tell me about how I have to change the framework of physics? And that's really how innovation happens. A second aspect of elastic thinking is how we frame questions. If you're an artist, you know that one of the most important things when you're making a painting or a sculpture is to decide what it's about, what you're going to look at, what you're trying to achieve in a more general way. What is the composition? What are the colors? Or what is the idea? The idea is the big thing behind a painting or any kind of artwork. And then afterwards comes the execution. The idea and the feeling of it is the elastic part. The execution is the craft, which is more the analytic part. It's the same thing in science. The more important than being able to do the math as a theoretical physicist, more important than being able to do the math or to solve your problem is to have the initial idea of finding a good problem to solve or to try to solve. Because if you're very good at solving problems, but you only pose to yourself uninteresting problems that have no future, you're never going to get anywhere. But you can actually get somewhere by posing very interesting questions, even if you can't solve them, because that's really the the fuel of physics is the interesting questions and ideas. And how you frame a question often either precludes you from finding new discoveries or finding certain answers, or it leads you to it. And so it's really, really important. This slide illustrates that through an incident that happened when I was a kid with my rabbi, who's pictured here. My parents always sent me to services on Saturday, and I had to go, and I didn't mind that much because the other kids' parents sent them as well. And so we would sit there in the morning and plot when we would play baseball in the afternoon, which we did every Saturday and Sunday. And we would talk, and that wasn't so unusual because guess what? The adults were talking too. The Jewish services tend to be places where people really talk. And later in life, I've gone to a lot of Catholic services. I know it's not like that in all services, but the Jews, they tend to talk. And the rabbi didn't always like that. He would sometimes pound his fist on the table to get people to quiet down. And one time he gave a sermon about talking. But what's interesting is because he was interested in Talmudic philosophical questions, the sermon was on one level about talking and another level about framing questions. Because he said, this is what he said in his sermon. He said, I could ask in two different ways whether it's okay to talk in the service. I could say, is it acceptable to socialize with your neighbors while praying? And then I would answer it this way. I'd rather you didn't. You're here to worship, and your banter is distracting, if not disrespectful. But I could, or you could, ask me a totally different way. You could say, hey, is it okay to go to the synagogue and pray while I'm socializing with my friends? Different way of posing the question. And that way he would say, sure, we're always happy to have anyone who wants to come. Different question, different answer to the same topic. The way the answers that you get or the knowledge that you're led to depends on how you look at the question. That's why the poet Rilke, who also recognizes, said, be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions. This slide illustrates that in a very graphic way, in a literal way. It shows how the boundaries of your thinking and how you frame your problem really affects your ability to find an answer. This is called the 9-dot problem. It's been around since around 1920, and it's extremely difficult. The challenge here is you want to put a pencil on any dot you want, and then draw 4 lines without lifting your pencil or retracing your line, and you want to cover all 9 dots with just 4 lines without backtracking or lifting your pencil. In psychology laboratories across the country, this has been tested really for the last 100 years, and almost nobody gets this. Sometimes 0%, the most I've ever seen in a study is about 10%. And there's a good reason for that. As the Gestalt psychologist taught us in the 1930s, humans have a very visual way of organizing the world, and your brain we now know has multiple layers of visual processing. And one of the things we do is we impose geometry upon objects or shapes that we see. So when we see this square, we look at it and we go, we form a border around the edges of the square. We don't see it as 9 dots, but we see it as a square. And so here's some of the solutions that people have come up with in trying to answer the question. None of them work. A lot of them violate the actual rules I gave. So it seems like maybe this was given in a university class where people don't follow directions, I find. But in any case, no one solved the problem. But what I want you to notice about all these is they're all what? They're all within the borders that the 9 dots form. But guess what? Here's the answer. So to get the answer to the 9-dot problem, you literally have to think outside the box. And that's really, I'm saying this depends, this is an illustration of how you frame questions, because what your brain did is it framed the question not the way I said it. It didn't just say, draw 4 lines without lifting your pencil. It also implicitly said, and without getting outside the box, the border. When psychologists give the problem a different way, this way, with a huge box drawn around the little box that gives you room for the answer, your brain doesn't do that anymore. It accepts the larger box outside the smaller dots, the box formed by the smaller dots. And now about more than 50% of the people who are given it this way can solve the problem. So that's the importance of how you frame a question. Context is very important as well. This slide illustrates one application of the importance of context in economics and in decision making. This is illustrating a 1-bedroom suite in Tahiti. It's a room that goes for about $550 a night. Has a private balcony. It looks like a beautiful place. I wish I could be there instead of stuck on the International Space Station here, but oh well. What I do with this question, with this slide, is I ask people to estimate. I don't tell them that it's $550. I ask them to estimate what they think it would be worth. And just to show you the extreme effect of context on people's analytical thinking, let me show you what the answers they give me are. I can't see the right-hand side now, but I assume that you guys can see the group 2 column. Paul, shake your head yes if that's true. Okay, so I divide the audience into 2 groups, and I do a little mental manipulation on them, and then I ask them, how much would you expect to pay? Now, my mental manipulation, I'll tell you what that is in a minute, but after I do and remember, I didn't tell them what the actual cost was. When I do my mental manipulation to group 1, they tend to guess around $1,000 or $1,200. And group 2 guesses around $300. So one is way over and one is way under. What do you think I did? Well, before I asked them this question, I asked each group another question first. But that first question was different for each group, okay? So for group 1, the first question was, this room costs more than $5,500 a night. It's absurd, that's 10 times what it really costs. And people probably laugh and go, of course not. Little do they realize that they may laugh and say, of course not, but it has a huge effect. And when they ask them, what does it cost? Same thing with group 2, $55 a night is 1/10 of the cost of the room. They probably laugh at that, but it affects their thinking because the first question gives them context. And even though they both have the same data and they're analyzing the room and the first question shouldn't matter, it does matter because it changed the context. In behavioral economics, this particular effect is called anchoring. You can anchor someone to be high or low if you're trying to manipulate them in any kind of a negotiation by changing the context. The next element is divergent thinking or originality. And I'm going to talk about this a lot more later in the talk, but this has to do with ideation, how you come up with ideas. Not only how many ideas you come up with, but how different are they? It's very important to come up with different ideas because that's how you innovate, obviously. And finally, I'm going to talk about questioning assumptions. This is also, as I've already mentioned a few times, a very important part of elastic thinking, and it's really the key to almost any riddle that you see. So after this talk, if you want to check it out, go look up some riddles on the internet, and you'll see. And you can learn from this because once you get this trick, you become a much better riddle solver. Just give yourself a few minutes, and you can solve almost every riddle. This riddle says Marcia and Marjorie were born on the same day, same time of day, same day, month, year, same mother, same father, and they're not twins. How is that possible? Well, what's happening is, the reason this is hard to answer is the way the riddle is phrased, and this is the way it is with most riddles, it paints a picture in your brain, which is an implicit assumption that you're not aware that you're making, but that you are making. Just like with the 9-dot problem, you are making an implicit assumptions that you can't go outside the box. You're making an implicit assumption about the situation here. So the answer is they're not twins because they're, yes, triplets. They're triplets. So when I say especially with the 2 M's, it even makes it even more organic. Marcia and Marjorie, you're picturing a pair, and that precludes you from picturing 3. If you sit down and say, what are the assumptions I'm making here? You'll eventually come to the assumption that Marcia and Marjorie are the only kids involved. And then, of course, you break that assumption. The analytical thinking you need to get to the answer, once you break that assumption, is trivial. It's easy to answer once you know what you've been assuming. Companies also follow assumptions, just as I mentioned earlier, the supermarkets did, or the grocery stores 100 years ago, and they have a hard time sometimes accepting new assumptions or even understanding what the assumptions they're actually making. This stuff that I'm going to show you here describes a very successful company today that broke a lot of assumptions that were around before the internet age. Most of my workers, they didn't train their workers. They didn't do quality control. They didn't pay most of the workers. They didn't charge either. And this is one that I was taught back when I was learning about business. They a little upstart, went against established, venerable companies, and they put them out of business. How was that possible? Who was that? Wikipedia. When Wikipedia started, They violate all these assumptions. And there was another company called Encyclopedia Britannica that could easily be the Wikipedia of today, just like Blockbuster could be the Netflix of today. All these companies are companies that didn't survive because they didn't accept that things could change and that their thinking therefore has to also change. So let's get on to how the brain creates elastic thinking and what gets in the way. So your brain does different types of processing. One kind of processing is the one I talked about earlier that we do, that computers also do, that traditional computers do. It's called top-down processing. Programmer puts in the rules and somebody controls the machine, and the machine executes the rules. So your brain has these regions called executive structures that do that for you. They determine your the assumptions that you're making, where you're going to focus your attention, what your goals are, what framework you're going to use, and they kind of order your brain around and they focus you in a way of attacking a problem. And that's very useful when you're executing analytical thinking. It's the way most corporations work. The CEO and senior management come up with the strategies and the goals, and they tell the lower workers what to do. And a more extreme example in the military operates that way. A lot of organizations in our world and operate in that manner. But your brain is hierarchical and operates not only from the top down, but also from the bottom up and actually everywhere in between. There's all sorts of combinations of how it operates. But let me talk about bottom up processing now. Bottom up processing has to do with what complexity theorists call emergence or emerging order, emerging processes. These are processes that on the whole have a characteristic that's very different or impossible to really determine by looking at the parts. The whole is much more than the sum of the parts. Emergent processes happen when small parts of things have their own little specific programming that in the aggregate, when the things get together, form some beautiful new idea or process. A snowflake, for example, the individual water molecules have no master plan or blueprint for a snowflake. But when water is bouncing around and things start to freeze, somehow, because of their Lego-like structure, they end up forming these beautiful, orderly snowflakes. There's nobody who tells the molecules what to do and how to create these snowflakes. It just happens from their microprogramming, or actually from their physical makeup. Well, this happens in your brain as well. The individual neurons in your brain are very simple things. They don't have, the neurons in your brain don't have brains. They're just something that takes certain electrical input from many different other neurons and then sends outputs to other neurons after the inputs build up to a certain threshold. That's all they do. But from that come all your ideas, your thoughts, and your brilliance or your non-brilliance. And the best way to think about that or to understand it, and from our everyday world, I think, is through ants. Scientists who study ants tend to look at the colony as the organism more than the individual ants. The colonies in the ant world can do amazing things. This shows them building a bridge, for example. But the ants themselves are like your neurons. They're very simple creatures with a very simple programming, very inflexible, predetermined, and based on certain inputs, they produce certain outputs. If an ant bumps another ant, it tells it what to do. If it encounters a chemical, it does this or it does that. Just like the neurons or the snowflakes, they're pretty much fixed systems. But when large numbers of these fixed systems interact in a certain environment, nature over millions of years of evolution has built up their little fixed systems in a way that miraculously or seemingly miraculously, they interact and they form these beautiful collective phenomena such as this bridge. So there's no CEO of the ants telling them how to build the bridge. There's no designer or architect. There's no boss, no foreman. It's all these individual ants colliding, bumping in a certain way, reacting in their own very localized way that create things like beautiful structures like this. And your brain does that, and that's how your brain creates ideas. And your brain, therefore, is a tremendous interplay and integration of the top down and the bottom up. The important part of that is what we call idea filters. Now, your brain is so good at creating ideas from the bottom up as your neurons interact that you would be swamped, overwhelmed with all these ideas in your consciousness if they all came to your consciousness. Uh, your brain is an idea machine, and everything you see, hear, every sensory perception, every word that you think about or say or write creates associations to others, and these create ideas, and it's all a big bubbling cauldron of ideas. And the way your brain is structured, the ideas are all floating around in there, and then there are structures in your brain that decide which of them to present to your conscious mind. Those are all unconscious, just kind of chaotic things going on, and some of them pop into your conscious mind. Now, what would you think evolution would do? What would be a good strategy for deciding what ideas should pop into your mind? You encounter, let's say, a bear or an apple or a cliff. You get many ideas. Do I jump off the cliff? Do I give the bear a raspberry? Do I moon it? Do I run away from it? What do I do? Do I jump? Who knows? Your brain is coming up with the ideas. Some of them are silly. Some of them are just dumb. Some of them are ill-advised. Some of them are very strange, but maybe would work. And a lot of them are conventional. Well, what your brain does is it says to itself, which is pretty much how the brain normally operates, what has worked for me in the past? And whatever has worked in the past, it goes with. So when you're having ideas of how to react to a situation or how to solve a problem, the conventional ideas tend to come to you. So that's why conventional ideas are easy to get. There's certain ideas that many people can come up with because they're conventional, they're not out of the box, and they usually work. And there's a good reason that your brain does this, because they usually work. But in an unusual or new situations, they often don't work. Or if you're trying to innovate, that usually means you need an idea that doesn't normally work. And so the key to ideation, to coming up with innovation, is to learn how to control the filters. Now, these filters depend on the individual. Some people just naturally have the filters a little looser, more open. Some people have them tighter. Some people are more conventional. Some people are less conventional. The same people who have the crazy, brilliant ideas in music and art and science, often viewed by society as eccentric, because the filters that give them those crazy ideas, revolutionary ideas in art, like say to paint people's figures as triangles and squares, they also have social ideas that are weird or unconventional, and they follow those as well. So there's that correlation. But we all, by focusing on it and practicing, can learn to do things to allow our ideas to percolate up, our more original ideas. So this all has to do with harnessing your unconscious mind, and that's what this slide is about. I want to demonstrate to you how powerful your unconscious mind is. People used to say when I was a kid that we only use 5% of our brain, blah, blah, blah. That's totally false. We use our whole brain. But most of our brain is taken by our unconscious mind. That's true. And of course, it has a huge job to do. It has to beat our heart. It has to control our blood pressure, our body temperature, so many things, keep our balance. So there's a reason for that. But your unconscious mind has many intellectual powers as well. So this illustrates one. And if you can unlock those powers, you can really do a lot with that. This power that I'm going to talk about now has to do with human faces. The human species is a social species, and we only survived over the thousands and hundreds of thousands of years by cooperating with each other to compensate for our physical weakness. And one of the things that was very important in that is to recognize people and to be able to read their faces and their emotions from their faces. So your human unconscious is a superhero in reading and analyzing faces. It's hard to illustrate that superhero-ness in general, but there's a cute illustration that I can give you, because when your face is upside down, that superhero power does not work, okay? Evolution didn't need you to be a superhero in identifying people hanging upside down from trees. We're not bats. And so since it's so economical, our superhero power only kicks in when a face is right side up. So let me illustrate the difference between the non-superhero power and the superhero power. Obama here is upside down. The power of recognizing and discerning differences in his face is your usual power that applies to dogs, cats, trees, buildings. It's not that great. You can identify one building from another, but not nearly as well as you can tell one person from another. Watch what happens when I turn them upside down or right side up. Bam. What looked like two normal faces, now one is hideously deformed and the other one is normal, because our superhero power is working. With dogs and cats, this difference wouldn't look that great. It would look more like this, but with people, it is very stark. So what I want to do for your elastic thinking is to unlock the unconscious powers of elastic thinking. So in the last few minutes of the talk, I'm just going to talk about a few things that get in the way of elastic thinking that you can work on to nurture your elastic thinking, which is something that we really need to do. We're all so challenged today to do that. First, fight your fear of failure. Okay, so when I was first learning how to ski, I was about 20. I had a girlfriend who was an expert skier. I found that I had a hard time because I could get on I learned how to ski a little bit, but I didn't want to fall. And I was very stiff and I didn't have fun and I wasn't very good because I had to loosen up. You have to loosen up when you ski, and you have to loosen up in your mind too when you're thinking. If you want new ideas and you want those idea filters to let stuff pop in, you have to loosen up. So what I would do when I was learning skiing is I learned that in the beginning of the day, each day when I went skiing, I would fall. I would just take a fall. And that was it. I didn't have to be perfect anymore. I got that over with. I didn't worry about if I was going to fall again. And when you're coming up with new ideas and new ways of doing things, you have to overcome that fear. You have to allow yourself to fail. You have to go through many failures before you get a success. Second, which is related, you have to embrace being wrong. So I'm a theoretical physicist, and I know very well what it's like to be wrong. Any theoretical physicist will tell you that 9 out of 10 or 99 out of 100 of every ideas that they get are just plain wrong. The only difference is will you spend a minute on it or a month before you realize that it doesn't work. And that's fine. That's okay. It's okay not to know things. It's okay to question, to say that you don't understand. But that's really an important part, again, of elastic thinking, because think about your brain is trying to feed you conventional ideas. You want to tell your brain, no, brain, I don't mind having stupid ideas. I don't mind having wrong ideas. Let them all through and I'll evaluate them later. So it's a way of relaxing and getting to understand that it's okay to be wrong. And so this is something you can really do. I'm giving you these ideas because you can really do them in life. There's no magic pill for elastic thinking, but there's a way of embodying all these principles in your everyday life so that you become just over time a more elastic thinker. Third thing, banish distractions, interruptions. So we've all had that experience where maybe you're running, you're in the shower, you're just taking a walk, you're laying in bed staring at the ceiling. And elastic, in my book, I talk about Mary Shelley, who got the idea for Frankenstein after struggling for hours and days, trying to come up with some idea for a scary story, and then finally gave up, laid down and said, I'm just going to sleep. I want to forget this problem for a few days. And immediately, bam, well, not immediately, but after an hour or so, pops into her mind. As a physicist, happens to me all the time. I'm working, fighting with something. I can't analyze my way out of it. I finally give up. I go outside, let's say for a walk, or I get a cup of coffee. And I'm usually even thinking to myself, literally, I give up. And then bam, the idea comes, I go back and solve it. But that won't happen if you're distracted or have interruptions. If when I stop the physics and go to get the coffee, if I'm thinking about what am I going to make for dinner, or somebody email me, or I have to go to the store and buy XYZ, that idea is not going to pop into my head. So you really need time without interruption, and you need to just banish those distractions of modern technology. 4, accept uncertainty and explore. There's a human trait called neophilia that developed in us about 100,000 years ago. Neophilia, loving the new. Squirrels do the same thing every day, and they don't get bored. They never go crazy by having a boring day. We people who are being quarantined now are often getting stir crazy and feeling like we need some variety, something new to happen, some new experiences or some variety in life. That's because humans love exploring, and that's a great thing. It's something that the species needs, because the exploratory creatures back when we lived on the savannah would find the new resources, food, water, places to go. They would sometimes fall off a cliff or get eaten, so there's a danger to it, but the species needed them. And the same thing in your brain. You need to learn to allow those unconventional and uncertainty. You have to be able to accept the uncertainty in your thinking and not worry about where it's all going. Mindfulness. This is something that people talk about in many parts of society today. Thank God it's fortunately become, in the last 10 15 years, something that people, this in the mainstream and people meditate and think about. But if you want to manage your mindset, and I talk about how important the mindset is in elastic thinking, you have to know what your mindset is. And so mindfulness and mindfulness exercises are very good for understanding yourself and how you're thinking. Slow down to speed up. Okay. When I sit down to write in the morning, if I know that I have to be somewhere, let's say at noon for a meeting or a lunch meeting, and I get up at, say, I get started at 10, that's it. My whole day is ruined. I'm not going to come up with anything. I've learned this long ago. Don't make any commitment at noon. I'm going to start working at 10. I need to have what seems to me to be an unlimited time to write. Same thing when I do physics. If I sit down to do physics and I have just that hour, unless I have a very specific non-creative calculation to just grind through analytically, I can't do it. And why is that? That's because knowing that I have a deadline coming up, I become instinctively or on an unconscious level afraid to experiment, afraid to try something. If I'm writing, let's say, and I have to write a certain passage about something, when I have unlimited time, I'll try crazy, stupid things. You wouldn't believe the dumb stuff I put in my books it's fine because I just cut it out before I publish it. You can always, the editing is a wonderful thing to be able to do. So I can be free and tell stories and not worry about if they're good or bad or ugly. I just let them come. And later on, I can go and judge them. But if I know that I got to go to lunch in an hour and I'm not doing this consciously, but unconsciously, I want to get it done, what comes to me are trite, unoriginal, conventional things. And I'll write something and I'll read it later and go, oh, that's really boring. So I find that for me, for my thinking to be free and to let it loose, I need to have the illusion of unlimited time. And finally, welcome diversity and dissent. It's amazing the kind of effects that other people's ideas have on you. There have been a lot of studies, and we can read about them in my book, that show that different ideas, even if they're not valid, even if they're dumb or you think of them as dumb, they broaden your own thinking. So when people are trying to, they've done studies exposing people to ideas that are obviously wrong, ideas about what's green and what's blue, for example. And then after that, they give them a task where they have to come up with their own ideas. And after the exposure to stranger ideas at first, it allows them to come up with more creative ideas later, because in the ideation, it has opened their mind to a little bit bigger realm of possibilities. So welcoming diversity and dissent, or even seeking it out, talking to people who are different than you. When this quarantine is over, find people who are different than you to talk about. Try new food, new artwork, travel, all these things that expose you, that show you that the world can be different than it seems to be, allow you to come up with ideas also for a changed world. So let me just end with this quote by John Maynard Keynes, the economist. He said, "The ideas which are here expressed so laboriously are extremely simple, and they should be obvious. The difficulty isn't in the new ideas, but it's in escaping from the old ones." So thank you, and feel free to follow me or check out my website. And I will come back here. I'll come back to you full screen.
There you are. Thanks so much, Leonard, for a fascinating talk. Folks, Leonard's agreed to take questions for about 15 minutes. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box and I will ask one, Leonard, to begin. A number of the pieces of advice that you gave at the end of your talk, and most of them are aimed at us as individuals, things that we can individually do to try to develop more elastic thinking. And a couple of them I'm wondering about, because it seems like we are in a moment in our culture where thinking has become very unelastic. And there are certain pieces of advice you give: embrace being wrong, for example, or welcome diversity and dissent. It seems to me that in our society now, there are many people who refuse to ever be wrong, think they are never wrong, and who are very intolerant of diversity or dissent. And I'm wondering if you've thought about the benefits of elastic thinking in a more societal way.
Well, elastic thinking is something that if you take thinking, which is an individual thing, but you make it cultural change. Elasticity in culture is something that is very important in society. I think the American society does great in that. I talk in the book comparing innovation in America and other certain European countries, and we talk about the culture and the innovation over time. And you can see that it's pretty steady. The ranking and patents of the different countries is pretty steady over time because it has to do a lot with the culture of that country. And of course, this is a Wild West, anything goes. Often anything goes to make a buck, but anything goes kind of culture. And I lived in Germany for years, for example, and it's much different there. It's a very strict, they say, man macht das nicht in Deutschland, which means you don't do that in Germany. And here we seem to say we do whatever the hell you want to do, really. And Germany has a different view. German students, back when I was a student, I remember they studied, like, remember the pictures that I showed you? They were like the upper class, the very regimented, authoritarian. They took tons and tons of courses. When I went for my PhD, you take a few courses that just throw you sink or swim, figure out a problem, try to solve it or get out of here. If you solve it, you get a PhD. If not, you're gone. We don't really care about A's in courses. We care about you doing research problems. So that part is good. Whether the leadership, embraces being wrong is different. But on the other hand, I have to say I'm trying to stay off the political, but the current leadership has many issues with it. But one thing that it has often done and has successfully, and I think it is probably compensated to some extent for some of the shortcomings of the analytical abilities up there, is elastic thinking. It is not breaking every assumption, sometimes ethical assumptions, but breaking assumptions about political science. And at first people thought it was a joke and nothing was going to come of it. And I think that what we've seen is that assumption after assumption has been broken, and the person breaking them has been successful with a lot of that.
Well taken point. So the next question, how can we foster elastic thinking in school children in this time of COVID-19?
Oh my God, I love these
camps, other activities will face rigid restrictions on children's movements, interactions, and behaviors.
So, okay, so I mean, that's, first of all, let's talk about school systems. Okay. I use that picture for a reason, because for a couple of years I worked at Scholastic Publishing in New York to develop math education for grades K through 12. It was Scholastic is a reading company, and we were trying to move it to be a math and reading company. And I spent a lot of time studying math education and education in general, of the kind that Scholastic would supply aids and technological aids and programs for kids who were falling behind. And the school system is bifurcated. There's some is that black and white 1950 style, and some are the other way. And as I mentioned with the German graduate students, there's an unfortunate effect of creativity being knocked out of kids at early ages. Kids are natural elastic thinkers. Those filters I talked about are in your prefrontal cortex, and they don't mature till you're in your mid-20s. Kids tend to do crazy things. Kids, we smile and think they do silly things, or sometimes when I do weird things, people say I'm being childish or whatever. I take that as a compliment, because the reason kids do those crazy things is the filters aren't there and the ideas come to their heads. When I was like 11 years old, I jumped off a roof just for fun and screwed up my ankle, as you can imagine. And I wouldn't do that today, partly because I had the experience of what happens when you do that, but partly because the idea wouldn't even come to my mind. If I'm standing on a roof, I would never think, let me jump and see what happens. But to a kid, it happens. And what schools too often do is beat that out of them. One of my sons came back once from high school, and he had gotten something wrong on a geometry test. And so he showed it to me and asked me to explain what he did wrong. So I read the proof that he gave, and it was right. So I said, oh, look, it's right. So your teacher just didn't see that. Go back, and I'm sure she'll give you credit. So he goes back, comes back to me the next day, and goes, I still didn't get credit, Dad. I said, I don't get it. Did you show her that it was right? He said, yeah, she read it over again. She said, yeah, it's right. but it's not the way I taught you just to do this in class. That is the opposite of what we need, okay? And teachers, I'm not trying to diss teachers. They're underpaid, they're heroes. I mean, they do such a great job, but the culture in schools needs to be changed, and the reward system that comes down from the Department of Education needs to be changed, because what we need to do is value more the elastic thinking. Now, when you have the kids at home for the quarantine, it's a great opportunity, and it's also a great, I guess, burden, because no longer do you have that time to do your own work or whatever you have to do. Now you're the teacher, but it's a great opportunity, because if you value elastic thinking, you can give your kids, though, that kind of an education. You can, when you're doing math, you give them these things called manipulatives to play with, not just, you don't just have them do 25 flashcard problems. You have them learn things. You can go online, and there's a tremendous resources you can find. In all areas, you can do that. If you're studying history, you can be more idea oriented and less date and name oriented, and all sorts of things. So it's a real opportunity, but it's a tremendous. I have 3 kids, so let me tell you, I know it's a tremendous amount of work. Good luck with that.
Related to a point you just made, are there proven ways that new technologies can facilitate or encourage elastic thinking?
Oh yeah, there are. I don't know if you want to use them yet, but first of all, there's drugs. So I talk about drugs in the book. Drugs have a reputation amongst creative types as being very useful, and it's true. And today we know why, because we can see what the drugs do in the brain and how that affects those idea filters. So in the book, I discuss certain drugs. Some of them are legal, and what that does. Of course, the thing is that since these drugs are generally not legal drugs or not pharmaceutically prescribed, they have many effects. So for instance, take one of the ones that's legal here in California, marijuana. I have a wonderful quotes from Carl Sagan, who wrote about how marijuana helped his creativity and to see the world in a different way. Marijuana can be really mind-opening, but it has certain dangers. It's thought to be associated with schizophrenia, for example. So if you're perhaps in that direction genetically, and you take too much marijuana, you can become a schizophrenic. And there's all sorts of things, even with something as alcohol, which has been legal for many years since the prohibition. Obviously, it hurts your liver. It has other issues with it. So pharmaceuticals can affect your elastic thinking in very interesting ways, and drug companies are working on ways to do that in a controlled manner. I know that's big in Silicon Valley too, to experiment. I'm not recommending anything illegal or anything, certainly not bleach or any other chemical to ingest. But I'm just telling you what the science says. Now, in terms of technologies, there's a very interesting thing called transcranial magnetic or electric stimulation. This is a machine that you put on your scalp, and it sends electromagnetic energy into your brain in a focused way. And it's aimed at the prefrontal cortex, those idea filters that you have. 90% of the people who have this thing turned on can solve the 9-dot problem because it just takes away all that filtering, and the ideas come to you. Now, that is something that is also a little bit dicey. I think they do experiments with it today, but I have a very good friend who's a famous neuroscientist, and he's told me he would not be a subject in such experiments. They pass the internal review boards, but it's really not that well proven yet. And there are companies that offer it on the internet. I think they offer devices that do that. No one knows whether they're safe or whether they're effective. But in the future, give it 10 years, there'll probably be some sort of technologies like that.
So speaking of the future, we have a question. Do you have any sense or hope regarding the changes that will come as a result of this virus timeout? Do you think that it will encourage us to become more elastic in our thinking? And will it open new possibilities that will be positive ones?
Well, first of all, I think it will help everyone's elastic thinking, because you're forced to change the way you do things. So I'm talking about changing a paradigm, making a paradigm shift, changing the structure and your assumptions of your life. Well, your assumption of your life is you can go to the store and get toilet paper if you need it. It's not that anymore. So it's changing all that, and it's giving you certainly practice in elastic thinking. And on the larger cultural scale that you talked about earlier, it's changing. It's making the culture a certain elasticity too. Time will tell what the lasting changes are. But for instance, video medicine is one that is something that could have been done long ago and should have been done long ago, because quite often in the doctor's appointment, you have a consultation with your doctor and there's no physical exam or test needed. Maybe not all the time, but quite often, a fair amount of the time, it's that way. And that was not something that doctors did, partly because they're not compensated. The insurance companies have not been compensating doctors for emails and phone calls, which they should do. Because of the coronavirus now, they're compensating them for video calls. And so I've had some video calls with my doctor. Let me tell you, a lot easier for me. I don't have to go to the office. I don't have to sit there for 45 minutes waiting to get seen. I don't have to sit next to people sneezing on me either. So there's a lot of advantages to that. When I'm on, the video call has a little weight with it as well, because that's the nature of the doctor's business. But I could be doing dishes or physics problems while I'm waiting, no problem. I just have it on, and when he's there, I hear him, and I come and I talk. So I think that's one that's going to stay, and I think there'll be a number of cultural changes. These Zoom meetings that we have, Zoom talks are okay. I prefer in-person talks, but you know what? With my friends locally, I started out having Zoom cocktail parties. And then I said, why am I restricting to my local friends here? I have friends in New York I could have a cocktail party. Then I said, after I started doing that, I said, why have I gone all this time and not had these cocktail parties virtually with my friends in New York or in Germany or wherever they are anyway? Why did this virus have to do it? I should be having, what I realized is that when you have the virtual dinner or cocktail party with your friends, it's very similar to having them there. Like, Paul, I feel like you're with me. I'm not kidding, but even more so, 2 or 3 days from now, this is another thing that the Gestalt psychologists talk a lot about, how your brain normalizes things in your memory. It erases, it smooths out the edges, okay? One of the edges or details it smooths out is whether you're really here. I found that 2 or 3 days after I have one of these virtual cocktail parties, and I think back on my meeting with Joe or whoever it was, it feels the same as if I had been at the bar with him. It doesn't seem that different in my memory. It feels a little different when you're doing it, but in the future, it doesn't seem that different at all. So I'm going like, yeah, to me, it's going to open up. People will be continuing to do this. Businesses, for example. I used to fly around a lot when in those years I was an executive at Scholastic. I didn't really need to do that. We can have these meetings this way, quite, I mean, it's certainly not maybe all of them, but, but a lot of them. So there will be certain changes. Only time will tell. We don't even know how long the virus is going to stay with us, or how long we're going to be doing this. But I think there'll be some definite changes.
So you mentioned a little bit back that you wouldn't advise drinking bleach, but we have a question about welcoming dissent in the context of COVID. How do you respond to unconventional ideas about COVID, such as, is it caused by exosomes and not a virus, or unconventional solutions to the problem?
Well, I think people should be thinking up as many unconventional solutions. I don't know about causes. I'm not sure of the relevance of that. Just have to be careful, because to think up, what you want to do is get to the point where you think up crazy, stupid ideas. You don't want to get to the point where you're executing them. Okay. So I might get the idea to jump off the roof, and that go, ha, 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 that's wonderful, because I'm a kid, I'm kid-like, and these crazy ideas come to me. But when I start jumping and it's the third story, it's not good. So I admire, the idea to, there may be a certain lack of knowledge behind it, but to try using bleach. But then I say, after you have an idea like that, you have to use your analytical thinking to scrutinize it and not just accept it. So there's 2 stages to this. There's the ideation, where you come up with crazy ideas and never criticize someone for coming up with a crazy idea. But for sticking to it against the facts and the science, that's a problem. And it's not just a problem of philosophical problem of I'm for science, I don't like you being against science. It's when you go against science and you take actions, things happen. Planes can crash, right? Things can blow up. I used to be start out in chemistry. I know things will blow up. You get it wrong, things can blow up. You drink the bleach, you're going to die. So there's a balance. I admire people coming up with crazy ideas and being open-minded. I mean, some of my great friends who are scientists are tremendously open-minded about all sorts of things, ESP, whatnot, But then when they look at it, they behave accordingly. So That's my feeling about that. It's ideas are not fact-based. Ideas can be crazy. It's wonderful, and then you use your analytical thinking, and then you have actions to take, and that should take into account reality.
We have a question wondering, did you study with Feynman? And if you did, do you think he had an elastic mind in
Oh
his
my God!
everyday life? And if so, could you give examples?
Oh, I love Feynman. I got my first job at Caltech. I didn't study with him. I worked with him a little. I was got my first faculty position. I was at Caltech twice. My first stint at Caltech, I was a couple doors down from him, and I wrote a book called Feynman's Rainbow, A Search for Beauty in Physics and in Life, and that's about my interactions with him back then. He was a tremendous elastic thinker. He had all sorts of crazy ideas, and in fact, I'm working on one of them now. I'm just finishing a series of papers that show that the universe, as a physicist, what that means is that the laws of nature, at least the laws that we've started studying, a subset of laws of nature, but the laws of nature, the forces and particles of nature, those laws come from an underlying set of laws in a very different type of universe, that the universe can be thought of in a way as a big quantum computer. And this quantum computer is processing information just like computers do. And to us on the macroscopic level, who can't see a fine enough grain of the universe to see this happening, we observe not just macroscopic, but by that I mean even the level of atoms and protons. Even at that level, we can't see deep enough to see the computer, the world's a quantum computer. We just see particles and fields and forces and people and mountains. But underneath all that, the universe is really a quantum computer. And I've shown mathematically, I'm publishing a series of papers now on that topic. And guess what? Richard Feynman had that idea. He didn't do any work on it. He gave a talk on it. It was just a crazy idea he had in 1982. And it was just amazing. And I went back and read his old paper, and he was just throwing things out, and it was kind of considered a curiosity. It was more important in the world of quantum information in general, because he's considered because of that talk, one of the founders of the idea of quantum computing, but not the idea of the universe being one. But now that we've discovered that it really is one, he was speculating about that in 1982. It was crazy. I had a talk with him where he talked about, what if there's two times? So, we have 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. Can we conceive of a world where there's 2 dimensions of time? That's kind of like the drinking bleach stuff, Well, but in physics, what you can do with that is you can examine it analytically and mathematically and see if it's real or not. So he was just he was and he was always a bit nuts. And he liked art. He liked to paint. He liked to draw. He liked to do work in bars. He would sit down in a bar and do his physics there and play the bongo drums. And I mean, he was a crazy guy, and I love him. So read Feynman's Rainbow, and it's about his advice to me, because I was a physicist and a budding writer as well. And it was all about following your heart and your passion.
So, Leonard, we've been taking questions for about 15 minutes. Are you wanting to continue?
Oh, you go for 1 or 2 more.
Okay. The next one,
I welcome, but go ahead.
do you think the development of neophilia represents the inception of the human cultural project? That is, does it precede the coalescence of anything systematically ideological? If so, can the construction of novel language games be understood as both the basic expression of human neophilia and the fundamental process of culture?
So neophilia precludes culture and philosophy or even ideas. It comes, or at least abstract ideas. It comes from a time when human brain was much more primitive. It's about 100,000 years ago, I think. And what seems to have happened was a great climactic change occurred. Some kind of environmental change. They believe it was due to the climate, but I think it made water very scarce. And the human race, from whatever population it had, dwindled down, depending on whom you believe, to somewhere between dozens and hundreds, or maybe 1,000 individuals. And the ones who survived, they believe, are the ones who had explored more previously and had more ideas about where they can get water, or more willing to go further to look. And what they noticed was that human geographical spreading after that period, when the population started to recover, really accelerated, which is why they feel this is the origin of that gene. But there's a certain gene that's associated with that, with neophilia, and different variants of the gene, and they can actually see that people are more reckless if they have this version and less reckless if they have that version. So that was pre-ideological, pre-cultural. Now the question about games, can you repeat that part?
Can the construction of novel language games be understood as both the basic expression of human neophilia and the fundamental process of culture?
Well, it's an expression, it is in a way in a very abstract form, an expression, because neophilia, you normally think, or I would normally think of it, it has to do with, do I want to try goat testicles, or do I want to go visit Tibet? Or do I just, want to do a different exercise today because I'm tired of doing push-ups or whatever it is. We don't normally think of it necessarily in the purely intellectual realm, which of course, when I think about it, I have a lot of I am a very high, in my book, I have, by the way, tests for some of these dimensions of elastic thinking. And one of the, it's not really, I should call it, they call it an inventory or a questionnaire to rate yourself on a neophilia scale. And I'm off the charts neophiliac. So I'm constantly needing new things. And in my physics, it's very obvious because I'm exploring crazy ideas all the time. I don't like to get stuck on, I don't like to just do the obvious or conventional, carry this forward. I have an idea. Oh, this is something everyone's interested in. I think I have an idea how to do it. Let me do it. It's more like I want to go into new territory. So that's what that really is. So in a way, it's very pure neophilia in an intellectual way.
So the next question is, does elastic thinking feed on strong analytical thinking as a basis, or is it subliminal information in the mind that is channeled for elastic thinking?
That's a great question. So it's really separate from, so you need, now, sometimes I don't emphasize enough when I give these talks that I love analytical thinking. It's very important. And I'm only emphasizing elastic thinking because it's traditionally been underrated. They go, oh yeah, the artist kid, they need a little bit of that, but in general in society, we don't need that. But you do need that, even in your personal life. You have to question where you are, what you're building your life around, because there could be things that you can do, So analytical and elastic are separate kinds of thinking, but they complement each other. Elastic thinking has to do with the foundations of how, what are the concepts you use to think about something? What are the foundations? What's the framework? If in physics, for example, we talk about forces. Well, Newton invented forces, okay? The idea of a force wasn't there before Newton. Einstein, in his general relativity from 1916, did away with forces. So there's no forces in Einstein's theory. He looks at curvature of space and things. So it's a different set of concepts. It's a different way of seeing the world. He has a different set of concepts by which he sees the world. Like a colorblind person has certain concepts of shadings. You have different concepts because you see colors. Bats or other animals which see different spectrums or don't see them, they all presumably have different concepts by which they analyze and view the world. So the elastic and analytic thinking should be thought of as two sides of what coin, let's say, of human thought, or a spectrum. I like to think of it as a spectrum because there are, if you think about there are areas that are a little bit gray where you're using both, but they have to be used in conjunction with each other.
So we're now at 5:21. I see we're losing some of our participants. Can I ask you a final question?
One final question.
Okay, this one is a much more general one. What are you reading these days?
Oh, wow. I'm always reading many things at the same time, so I'll just throw out a couple. Man's Search for Meaning, a book about how people found meaning in concentration camps and survived psychologically. Actually, it sounds funny, but by chance, I'm also in the middle of Sophie's Choice, which is another book about the same period. But I have to say, I'm running a novel about that period. So my thinking is a little bit skewed there. And what else have I got going? All right, so let me just look at my desk here. Oh yeah, okay. Cathedral by Raymond Carver, one of my favorite authors. I'm reading it, but I'm really rereading it. I put on my, I think on my Facebook, I'm having a little book club, and I was thinking of some of the books that I love, and I went back and decided to reread that one. So there's a handful for you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Leonard, so much for a fascinating talk and a great conversation. It's been a true pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us for this fascinating talk by Leonard Mlodinow. For more information on other upcoming virtual events sponsored by the Oregon Humanities Center, or if you'd like to contribute to supporting our public events and research programs, visit ohc.uoregon.edu. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks again, Leonard. It's been a real pleasure.
Ciao.
Ciao.